Rain, sometimes a liberation, sometimes the very essence of your being seeping from its core. And so it was for Sarah as she gazed from her misted bedroom window. It seemed to be the very mirror of her heart, and that square of wood and glass between her and it, a veritable portal to her soul. For within she was bleeding from a wound inflicted by a boy she had given her all to, her first love, an absolute love that knew no bounds or distrust, but lived in a simple and exquisite state of bliss, a bliss that her youth imagined could not and would not end. But end it did, in a text on the 26th of December, from a boy called Michael, not a heartfelt conversation or a tender and careful release, but the brutality of words, unyielding, unforgiving weapons that cut her like knives. "It's over, we're through," it said. She begged to be loved, begged to be saved from the torture of loss. But her pleading came to no end, but to intensify her feelings of worthlessness, when no was all her piteous cries for mercy elicited. It had been 3 days since that bitter message had been inflicted on her, days spent in front of that window and on her bed, sobbing, with a brief and withering trip to his house, a trip which involved an apologetic mother, whose well-intentioned words of comfort were to say that she thought her son had made a mistake in his new choice of girlfriend, a fact that Sarah was unaware of, but that burned her in the hearing of it, and her return home was a wandering path wetted with the tears of oblivion. Now her small room and this window was all that was left of her world. Before that text, she had been beyond the stars. Now she was confined in this little man-made box, a prison for her dreams, wherein the reflection on that cold see-through surface, she could watch as her imagination decayed her hopes and wishes to dust. No sleep came to ease the torment, save for fleeting patches filled with nightmares, just gazing and raindrops rolling in a dark dance with the water falling from her own eyes. She hoped somewhere within that the pain would subside, even just a fraction would have been hope, but it only worsened. Each hour seemed more bitter than the last, and each day more crushing. Sarah could see little from where she was, just the neatly kept garden that her parents obsessed over. Parents who knew how to tend flowers, but who were now unable to offer anything meaningful to tend to her own needs, other than mumblings about getting over it. And from her window, beyond that preened patch of green, she could see 5 other dwellings with similar little carbon copies of nature, strangled to perfection. That is, all except one. One was unkempt, with grass a little too long to pass the OCD, good lawn-keeping exam, and its borders were beginning to show signs of freedom and overgrowth, revealing that the owner of this residence was not conforming to social norms, a renegade, a villain, an urban criminal no less. Not that this concerned Sarah. Her eyes stared into nothing when they were not a kaleidoscope of moisture. That was until the fourth morning. A scene played out in that mini wilderness in the making. A man and a woman having a row that spilled into the garden. He clutching a bottle and swaying, and she shouting about something. Her shrill voice was hard to discern at that distance. But for the words, "It's over." Then he sitting on some steps, head in hands, while she carried various bags and items to her car, before leaving to who knows where. It was a momentary diversion for Sarah, a fleeting release from the macabre fairground ride of despair she was tied to. But as the woman drove off, it came back, stronger than before, as if seeing similar miseries played out in others took her somehow deeper into her own suffering. She watched as the man sat in the rain, occasionally lifting his head to take a swig of his preferred emotional anesthetic. An hour passed, then two, before this pathetic figure removed himself to his house, reappearing a short time later in what Sarah assumed was the living room, his drink still in hand as he sat on his sofa in front of his TV, a TV he clearly wasn't watching, as he appeared to be staring at the floor. No doubt it was background noise, his attempt to distract himself from whatever unravelling was taking place within him. So Sarah gained an odd vision of her own future in this unknown man. No doubt that couple had been together many years. No doubt they had loved each other, she thought. Yet here they were, broken, their dreams like hers, gone. It offered a picture of her fate, that even if she could get over Michael, that there would be someone new, and they would treat her hard as he had. And she would end up like that man, just older, with less options. Then he became a point of fascination that her eyes were drawn to between waves of tears. She wanted his wife to return, for if he could be saved from his misery, so might she be. It was a glimmer of hope for her, and so she watched. He didn't leave his sofa, except for moments, to seemingly grab more drink, and when sleepless night came, he merely slumped into an alcohol-induced stupor, while Sarah's torture knew no similar interruption, but was intensified by the nocturnal stillness. Day 5 came with a grey dawn, overcast and foreboding. The rain had stopped, but anyone could see that it would soon return. Sarah, shrunken from 5 days of food refusal, was attempting to eat an apple that she had unwillingly taken from a pre-dawn kitchen, but half was enough to fill her knotted stomach before she returned to the comfort of isolation. The man, too, seemed to have stirred. He had gone from his room when Sarah returned to her window, reappearing with more bottles soon after, as he took up his usual place on his sofa. A voice in her head then threw down a gauntlet. "He's like you, Sarah," it said. "Unlovable, unwanted, and worthless." She had no means to counter it. Michael had been her world. He had promised her everything, told her he loved her, and yet in the end he had decided that she was not worthy of it. He had taken it all away only after he truly knew her. Michael, who was perfect in her eyes, didn't love her. So how would anyone? And how could she ever be any more than that man? An object of rejection. The more she looked at him, the more intense her feelings became. To end up a 40-something wreck, was that what love is, she thought. And as the day wore on, her eyes fixed on that room more and more. But not solely on the man, but on a large mirror that was on the wall to his left, in which she could partially see his other side, and the reflection of a doorway which led from that room. Her gaze drawn there by some shape which seemed to move in the shadows in whatever room was beyond. Sarah wondered if this was the man's pet, or maybe he had children, but whatever it was, it never entered that room, and the man seemed oblivious to it, or ignorant towards it. The day took on a dreamlike quality to Sarah, and she sat, wiping away her near-constant stream of sorrow-laden tears, until by nightfall a relent came in their flow, which she put down to her lacking water as opposed to any healing. In fact, her injury seemed worse. It had all the feel of an infection, but not one caused by bacteria or some virus, but something more insidious, more incurable, from which there was no release. She knew that in a few days she would have to re-emerge from her shell once more, take her place back in the world and face him. But she didn't want to go back to it. She wanted to stay here, looking out of that window, and never see the world from beyond it. The man stood up at 9 p.m. exactly, a shadow moving outside his room just moments before. Then an upstairs light came on, before being extinguished seconds later. The man, reappearing in his usual place, carrying some object that Sarah couldn't quite make out. 10 p.m. came, then 11, and Sarah's eyes never moved from that room. She had some dark thought that told her what that man had brought back with him. She watched him and looked at that mirror. And then something caught her eye, that movement again beyond his room, a shadow, and just the faintest glimmer of something else. So far away, so minute, that she couldn't be certain. 2 dots, 2 red points of light, close together and barely discernible, that were fixed on that beer-soaked form sat on that sofa. 12 p.m. came, then 12:01. Sarah could feel it. She knew what was going to happen. She could almost hear his thoughts, as if someone was screaming it out from that house. "End it," it said, over and over, like a piercing, sickening white noise that tore at the fabric of her mind. 50 seconds later, a light flash filled that room, followed by the retort of a gunshot, as the man's head flew back, his blood and brains spattered against the shards of glass that weren't shattered by the passing of the bullet that ended his life. Sarah stared in horror. It almost felt like it had happened to her, as if that bullet had passed through her own skull. She knew she should run and call the police, or or tell her parents, but she was frozen. She couldn't take her eyes off that man's body, slumped across his sofa. In a strange way, he had been a peculiar reflection of her, and now he was dead. His suffering had been less visible than hers, yet it was deadly. She looked as lights came on in other houses, and then she could make out the sound of a far-off siren. But as it got closer, she became aware of something else, something in that room with the man, shadows flitting around his body, and small points of light, barely visible and red in colour. They were only there for moments at a time, and then within no more than a few minutes the slowly approaching commotion and movement of neighbours seemed to diminish these vaporous phantoms, until only one was left. She could see it reflected in that mirror, red eyes and a vague smoke-like form. Sarah stared in disbelief. She could see it, but she denied it. It had to be a trick of the light, she thought, but she couldn't take her eyes from it. And then, for an instant, it was like she was being drawn out of her window. Her consciousness pulled through the air towards those eyes as they stared at her, stared into her being. Her mind snapped back and the image was gone. An illusion, or delusion, brought on by the lack of sleep, she pondered. An untidy garden had now people in it, approaching the shattered window. Then the police arrived, then an ambulance. A scene of commotion and sudden concern to deal with a man who an hour before was lost to the care of humanity. Then he was gone, his body removed, window boarded, and Sarah was alone again. Her parents had visited her briefly to make sure she was okay. She didn't reveal that she'd seen the man die. Her inner turmoil didn't want their company or concern. So they left, content that they had done what good parents must. But they were blissfully unaware that they'd left their daughter in a merciless state. Sarah had been in despair, but now she had a message. An adult had pointed the way out. Someone suffering just like she was, and now they were not. But those shadows stuck in her mind. What were they? They terrified her, and at the same time, somewhere deep inside her, she knew them, as if she had seen them before, but not with her physical eyes. And then a thought flooded her mind, that she had the same choices that man had. She could go on. To what? To what he had. A life wasted on a love that would only corrode you, destroy you, or a doorway out, an escape for a heart that was too fragile for this world. She couldn't endure what she suffered now. How would it be in 20 years, she thought. After all, if Michael didn't love her, then what was this life for, she thought. And that line kept repeating in her head, a feeling of desire for release accompanying it. Release from suffering, release from the pain of life. Sarah tried to fight it, but that death scene she had witnessed was fixed in her mind. That could be you, a voice said. You can be free. this misery can end. Her head was spinning. She picked up her phone. More than ever in these days of despair, she needed to see that Michael had messaged her. She needed his words, his love, to see that he didn't mean it, that he wanted her to forgive him. But her phone was empty, save for messages from friends that she couldn't bring herself to reply to. And so there was no salvation from those words in her head, a relentless, grinding instruction in her own inner voice, telling her to take the path he had taken. She opened her bedroom door and ran downstairs. The kitchen, cold and empty, as only one item there drew her gaze. The knife rack, shining steel, jarring the air around it with its brutal possibility. Soon the blade was in her hand, and the stairs passed beneath her feet as streaming eyes guided her back to her sanctuary. But it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a gateway to oblivion, horrifying and seemingly inescapable. She sat on her bed and placed the knife to her wrist, bitter and cold against her flesh, the very physical embodiment of the harsh cruelty inflicted on her for the loss of her love. But this cruelty would be absolute and swift, a life of suffering condensed into a moment. Fear of it welled within her, fear of the cot, a horrifying dread, a dread that she knew was natural and true, but at the same time that voice, it screamed, "Do it. He doesn't love you. Without him, you are nothing, worthless." She pressed the razor-like edge into her skin. The draw of it, swift and quick, was all it would take. Then a thought of salvation came. Maybe that man wasn't dead. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe that wasn't the way out. She turned to peer into the darkness, pressing her face against the window. But she could see it. Those wooden boards that told her it was all too real, that there was no salvation. Only the knife, as for him only the gun, and her heart sank at seeing it, as all the twisted horror of those days seemed to come together and scream in her head. It's over. Your life. Over. She grasped the handle of that weapon. Choking in grief, she brought it back to her fragile limb, a terrifying intent passing down her right arm that would carry away all that she was. Her head spun, and her inner self sank as the final moment became inevitable. The silence around her filled with the bedlam of her own thoughts of self-annihilation. The instruction released, an electrical signal from her brain that was to seal her fate. And then she saw it, in her mirror, from the corner of her eye, a shadow, and eyes that watched her, filled with dark intent. And from its gaze a voice, her voice, distinct from her own, yet exactly as hers, willing her on within her head. giving her no chance of exit other than a slice through her veins. And slice the knife did, as her soft skin yielded to the pressure of her will to be extinguished, and a single drop of blood ran down her flesh as she turned towards the mirror. It was there, as clear as her own reflection, real but not real, a sickening visage that struck at her very soul. Its eyes focused on that crimson liquid seeping from her arm. She followed its gaze to that savage blade, and those red eyes were reflected there too. She knew in that split second, knew that this was its doing, that Michael was its doing, loss of his love, or maybe even the love itself, had all been its work, and that this end for her was its creation. Her arm twitched as her message of final obliteration arrived, but another was right behind it, a message of life. The blade then fell from her hand as torrents of tears came, tears not of sorrow, but of freedom. Her eyes lifted to look again at that being, an image then only visible for a fraction of time, of eyes filled with malice and rage. The mirror bowed, and then that window on another world shattered, showering Sarah with the shards of glass. She quickly concealed that weapon and the few drops of blood it had shed. Her parents came running, concerned for their daughter for the first time passing properly through the synapses of their brains. But she was fine now, happy even, and claimed, truthfully so, to be over that loser Michael. He did call her a few days later, begging to be taken back, but Sarah could hear another voice, a familiar voice at the back of his, and she wasn't about to fall for the romance of its teenage marionette twice. Many years later, his careless youth behind him, Michael would grow fond of drink, and his garden would grow wild. One day his wife, whom he loved, would leave him for reasons which would scream into her head, taking their children with her. And as he sat alone on his sofa, a cold gun in his hands, his fate and his future seemingly inescapable, a pair of red, glowing eyes would watch him from the shadow, eyes that knew his weakness and had crafted his condition, eyes that craved one thing above all else, the blood of innocence.